Okay, perfect. Anyways, welcome everyone. And I appreciate all of you who've basically, many of you have been following my posts for well over a year now on some of the research on my family, and especially those on social media. And to a certain extent, I was sort of overwhelmed by the response. I didn't really think that people would be that interested, but my wife is always right and I'm always wrong. And so here we all are. And again, I want to thank everyone who's been following this very, very personal journey of mine that will culminate one day in a book if I ever get it back from my editor. She's not listening tonight. She's busy, so I can say that. I just want to mention, if for those, and this is another plug, but if you're interested in what's happening with the book that eventually will come out, then feel free to sign up for my newsletter, which you can find on my blog, and that's williehandler.com. It's not hard to remember, because I provide monthly updates on what's happening. And I'm just going to load up my presentation. Being a longtime civil servant, PowerPoint always works for me. And I just need to find that PowerPoint. It must be. And there it is. Okay, I'm going to start it. There we go. Oh, now how am I going to let people in? Ooh. Let me see. I'm going to have to play with this because I'm going to have to let people in still. All right. I should have thought of this. Why didn't I do this in the dry run? Okay. I'm going to just take this down and let in whoever left in, and then that's it. Okay, I think everyone is in. Okay, well, I'm going to go back. Sorry about that. Okay. All right, so where it all began. So where it all began. Well, about 2 years ago, I began researching my family. My wife actually, she's the one who told me I should write I should write a book about my family. I thought really no one would be interested. And finally, I decided maybe it was not a bad idea to do. And I began doing research, and what I discovered was I knew very little about my family history. And really, to write a memoir, you really need to understand yeah, that's probably not a bad idea. To really understand, just a second. To really understand the past, you really to understand yourself, you have to understand your past. So I decided this book is going to serve multi-purposes. One is future generations of my family will really understand where they came from and who their ancestors were. when I speak to people, the average person, they know their parents' story and they sort of know their grandparents' story, but beyond that, they really don't know. And I thought I would leave sort of a written legacy. But as well, uh, the last few years, there have been growing anti-Semitism, and in particularly a lot of misinformation about the Holocaust. And I thought writing a book that highlighted the Holocaust with names and faces can have us, will make a very big difference. And so when I started writing, of course, one of the things I found was I had very little to go on. My parents really didn't talk much about their experience, and either did a lot of their friends and other family members. It just wasn't a topic that people were very comfortable. If you ask my father questions, he tended to get very emotional and upset. And after a while, you just stopped asking. And so when I started routing around for information, I came across my father's reparation application, which gave at least a very brief summary of his wartime experience. As well, the Shoah Foundation, which was created following the release of Schindler's List, with the support of Steven Spielberg, a number of they went around and interviewed survivors, and my mother was one of those survivors that were interviewed. Believe it or not, I never listened to her interview until last year, and then I listened to a number of interviews from family, friends, and some other relatives, and began to pick up a lot of information from them. Then I started hitting genealogy databases, places like JRI Poland, which has some very valuable data, Erosin archives. I joined Ancestry, did DNA testing, and found some connections there. In fact, this past weekend, I connected with 3 distant family members that I did not know existed. One of them is in Baton Rouge, one is in Los Angeles, and one is in Belgium, of all places. I had no clue that there were surviving relatives in Belgium. And lastly, and one of the participants is Jeff Simbler, and he has a Facebook group from the Zagłębie region, which is where my father came from, and he actually organized a trip to Poland, which was very valuable for me. Why did I go to Poland? Well, first thing is, when I first started writing my memoir, and it's gone through numerous drafts, but I did at one point in the spring send it to a publisher, and the feedback he gave was that it was a great historical piece, but he felt there wasn't enough narrative. And I went about over the spring and early summer rewriting the entire book, and added a lot of narrative, but I thought it was still lacking. And I thought that the sensory experience of walking down the streets, the same streets that my ancestors did, I would benefit a lot from that. As well, going through my family's history and recalling my childhood and interactions with my parents opened up a lot of wounds that I think had been compartmentalized for quite a while. And so I thought there would be some closure for me as well. And lastly, I was interested in seeing what Poland was like today. Certainly I'd heard from my father what his impressions of Poland were, and they weren't very complimentary. And for a very good reason, because the 20s and 30s, there was a relatively a fair amount of anti-Semitism. There was Poland was a newly recreated country following World War I. It had a right-wing government, and actually, it's interesting. I think William Binder, who I connected with this weekend, and he's a distant cousin, provided me with a letter from my great grandfather that he sent out to a number of his children, sort of like an update of what's going on. And he lamented about the anti-Semitism in the village that they lived in, and that there were boycotts. The Poles were boycotting Jewish merchants, and they were actually getting, and they were feeling the pinch. So what was pre-war Poland like? Very briefly, there were 3.5 million Jews. That's 10% of the Polish population. So they were a very significant group. There were approximately 1,400 Jewish communities referred to as shtetls. And those might be tiny little villages of 100 families or fewer, or it could be, medium-sized towns and even large cities. I mean, Warsaw had 350,000 Jews living, about 1/3 of the city at the start of World War II. Each community had at least one synagogue, and not only did it have, one or two synagogues, but there were what is referred to as stiebels, small little prayer houses. There could be numerous ones. And I know that town of Benjin, where my father lived prior to the war, had approximately 25 little prayer houses in addition to the main synagogues. And there were almost 1,200 Jewish cemeteries throughout Poland. Jews were predominantly merchants and artisans, but they filled all kinds of other jobs as well. Some of them were, they were politicians, they were professionals, and so on and so forth. And so they were quite integrated in Polish society, although in the small little villages, they still sort of kept to their own. Cultural, social, and political organizations flourished. But again, as I mentioned, there was still a considerable amount of anti-Semitism. My ancestors, they originated from Weslica, and I should mention that is probably, that's I believe the Yiddish is Wesliczka. But anyways, they were there for at least 200 years, probably longer, but there are no records that I could locate to really indicate how far back, because it wasn't until mid-18th century that Jews in Poland started actually using surnames. And my father, he was born in Wesliczka in 1912, and our family name was Oxenhandler. He was the fourth of 6 children, and the family moved to Benjin in 1930. And it sort of makes sense based on that letter that I had read over the weekend from my great grandfather, which is basically economically, it was Weslica was a very tough go for Jewish families at that period of time, and it's also during the Great Depression. And Benjin, it was a much larger town of 50,000, with about approximately half of that was Jewish, and there was a lot more economic opportunities. the family themselves they were butchers. And in fact, even when my father came to Canada, he started off in selling and butchering chickens. Prior to the war, my father met his first wife, Esther Sledge, who was actually from a village close to Weslika called Pinchov. And just moving ahead, I just want to talk very briefly about what the war years was like in the town of Benjin, where my father was from. It was invaded by the Germans on September 4th, 1939. And immediately a number of restrictions began, and Jews were restricted on what streets they could walk on. They were required to wear white and blue armbands with a Jewish star on it. There was a curfew. And then on the 9th of September, the main synagogue was destroyed. It was basically, it was firebombed, doors were locked. It was on the Sabbath, prayers were going on. People who tried to leave were shot at, and a number of people were able to escape, and they ran up to a church which was just on the top of the hill behind the synagogue, where a priest opened their gates and let some survivors in and provided some care to them, and then they later snuck out. He subsequently was bestowed righteous among men by the Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Benjin never had a walled ghetto, which was much more typical in Poland during the war. And as such, it attracted Jews from other communities. So where people were able to escape from their towns and villages, in some cases they made their way to Benjin. Over time, the restrictions increased, and the number of streets you could even walk in were restricted, and eventually, there was a major deportation that took place in August of 1942, and in fact, there was a commemorative ceremony on August 12th while we were in Poland, just to remember that event. And that was, though there were deportations prior to that, that was a major one. Not only included the town of Benjin, but the towns as well, towns adjacent to them as well. Eventually, there in late 42, early 43, there was actually a ghetto created in a impoverished area just outside the center of the city, where Poles lived. And those who remained, who were still around, and were moved into that part of the ghetto. In fact, the photo you have here, actually that's a work group, but I have pictures later on of people moving into the ghetto. Now this, and eventually that ghetto itself, which was fully occupied in 1943, and I have to tell you, there were several thousand people living in approximately 300 and some odd houses, and those were really rundown houses with no plumbing. So there were multiple families in each home. This same pattern basically took place in every Polish city, town, and village. Eventually, each ghetto was liquidated and people were sent to one of the concentration camps. And in the case of Benjin, Auschwitz was only 25 miles away, and that was where essentially everybody in that town went. Now, even before, prior to that, though, and I should mention that during the there were during the deportation in 1942, really the population was, there was a selection that took place, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail how it went, but basically there were the elderly, women with young children were sent to Auschwitz, and that is when my father and my father's family were sent to Auschwitz and were killed there. Others, I had other family members who were working in factories in Benjin, and they stuck around until the final liquidation in 43. My father was actually, and a couple of his siblings were sent to labor camps earlier in 1942. And in fact, my father was in 7 different camps before the war ended. I have this chart here. This is only part of my, this is only part of the family tree. Basically, this is my, and I sort of crossed out people who were killed in the Shoah, the Holocaust. And so my 2 grandparents, I have 2 aunts here, my father's first wife and his 2 daughters, and excuse me, and my uncle had one of his children, his youngest son, was killed as well. Now, this doesn't look like very many people. But in fact, I probably lost somewhere between 50 to 100 family members. My great-grandfather had 9 or 10 children, and each one of them, most of them had very large families. I know one of my father's uncles had 7 kids and 6 grandkids at the start of the war. And I believe that entire branch of the family were killed. I don't think any survived. And so as I started putting together the picture, there were a lot of people, a lot of, I would say perhaps 80, 90% of my family were wiped out. So just getting post-war Poland very quickly. Only about 250,000 of the 3.5 million Poles actually survived the war. And I can tell you, my father did not return to Poland. When the war ended, he was in Germany. And he stayed in Germany until 1948, and then made his way to Israel. And that's where he met my mother. Some of those that returned to Poland were quite, and one of the reasons that people often return was they would go back to their hometown to see if anybody survived. So the idea was, go back to where your family was from and try and find out what happened to the other family members. But what they ran into was often very hostile neighbors. And in fact, Poland had several pogroms between 1945 and 1946, which was probably a signal to many people And I know of, and I know of people who whose families um, had returned and had very, very negative impression about what post-war Poland was like. And so they made their way to Canada, United States, and Israel. And though there was a number of Jewish people who remained in Poland after the war, but at a certain point, communists sort of turned on the Jews, and in particular after the Six-Day War in 1967, and Jews were basically evicted from the country in 1968. So let's get to Poland today. In certain respect, Poland was Hitler was almost successful in making Poland free of Jews. There's probably only between 10 and 20,000 Jews remaining in Poland today. Most of those 1,400 communities have no Jews, and we did travel through quite a number of villages, and they were absent of any Jewish people anymore. Many synagogues and cemeteries were destroyed throughout the war. Now, but interesting enough, and I should say that there is also a bit of a renaissance that is taking place in Poland today, and the Poles that I ran into, not all of them, but many of the Poles that I ran into were very interested in Jewish history, and really considered Polish Jews to be part of their history, sort of a relic of their past. We had one tour guide who took us around Krakow, and she has a master's degree in Jewish studies, and in fact could even read Hebrew. When we were in Auschwitz, it was packed with Polish families visiting the site, the museum. Although I did also run into, I remember I ran into twice, I was in restaurants and I was talking to the servers, and they didn't know what Auschwitz was. So there are those who are in Poland, they're enlightened, and as a case here in North America, there are those who are not. But we really did not, although I'm sure it exists, I did not sense any anti-Semitism at all, and people were very, very welcoming. In fact, when I spoke to people, I told them that I was working on a memoir. There are a number of people who kind of stepped forward and offered to help me in one way or another. So a large portion of the trip was visiting synagogues and cemeteries, because it speaks a lot to what Poland is like today, and what's happened to these important Jewish facilities. So the Nożyk synagogue in Warsaw, and I should say, as I mentioned, Warsaw was the home of 350,000 Jews prior to the war. It's the only, as far as I know, the only active synagogue in Warsaw today. It was opened in 1902. It actually survived the war, though with a lot of damage. And I should add, 85% of Warsaw was destroyed during the war. But the synagogue was used as a horse stable by the Germans. It did undergo extensive restorations and was reopened in 1983. And I should mention that uh, this there still probably exists a number of smaller prayer houses, but you have to remember that, you know, where there were hundreds of thousands of Jews in Warsaw, the numbers are now hundreds. We stopped at a couple small little towns, and you have to excuse my pronunciation because Polish is, because I'm going to butcher the name, but one was Jaworzno synagogue. And this was very interesting. This is a small town of about 200 Jews. The nearby town had 500, and this was this building here was a synagogue. It actually burned down before the war, and was rebuilt before the war began. It went through extensive damage during the war, and today is a pub. And in fact, a couple of us went inside and asked one of the servers if she was aware that it used to be a synagogue, and she was surprised to hear that. This is not the only synagogue that was used as that is being used for other purposes. This was a little town of about 1,000 Jews, and I wish I could pronounce this, but I believe it's Chivazki Velki or something like that. It was actually destroyed in 1935 and was renovated. The interior was just devastated by the Germans, and after the war, it was just being used as a warehouse. And today, it is a condemned building, and it's basically falling apart. We went in Krakow, we saw this, what used to be a synagogue, and it also is a bar. Now, the bar opened up in 2016, and we stepped inside. There's this synagogue had beautiful frescoes, and you can see on the right there that there are, you can see some of the frescoes while people are dining. And the shame is that the owner of the bar is not really maintaining not looking after these frescoes, and they continue to deteriorate. And I understand that the Jewish community in Krakow is quite upset about it. There above the bar it was interesting, is a sort of a balcony which used to house the women's section, because back in the day these were all Orthodox synagogues, and so men and women sat separately. It's a real shame. There was a space, the space that used to contain the ark. The owner removed it and put in a door. And so that's kind of the story. What happens to synagogues that are no longer in use? And to be honest, why would you need 1,000 synagogues for such a small population? We did visit Pinchov, which was where a portion of my grandma was from there, but as well other family members also lived there. It was it was only about 25 miles from Vizlica, and the population between those two villages, they sometimes would relocate, and there was a fair amount of intermarriage between those two communities. This town had about 3,700 Jews. It was about 65% Jewish. Most of them were sent to Treblinka in probably in 1942, 43. This particular synagogue was quite amazing. It was built during the Renaissance, I believe in 1596. And again, it was destroyed during the war, was burnt down, but the stone, it's mostly a stone structure. And so the shell at least survived and has since been restored, is now a museum, part of the regional museums in Punjab. It also had, you can probably make it out a little bit in the picture on the right, but it also has frescoes and on the ceiling as well. And then Punjab also had 3 cemeteries. And why they had multiple cemeteries is that when a cemetery was filled up, they would build another one. And the first one was built in the 15th century. So, as each one fills up, a new one is built. The cemeteries were all vandalized. But interesting that following the renovations of the synagogue, there was an effort made to try and figure out what to do with what was left of the gravestones. They were moved to this synagogue and eventually built into the exterior stone fence, and sort of as a memorial. And an interesting thing to do with gravestones, but that's exactly what they did. And then with the Ramah Cemetery is a very, very old cemetery in the Kazmira section of Krakow, which was the old Jewish quarters. It had a very small synagogue and a cemetery. It was named after a revered rabbi, and his tombstone, which is on the left, actually survived even the Holocaust. The Germans used a lot of gravestones were knocked over, and some were used as paving stones. After the war, they were eventually returned to the cemetery, and they tried to restore the cemetery as best as they can. And as you can see, they lined up all the tombstones, and they were like in rows. And I don't believe that's how they used to look, but that's how they set them back up. And then I mentioned in Benjin, the synagogue was destroyed on September 9th, 1939. That synagogue, actually, I should talk a little bit about Benjin because, but that Jews first moved into the area in the 13th century. Eventually, in the 15th century, a synagogue was built and the first cemetery. This particular synagogue, which I am told by family members was a magnificent synagogue, was built in 1881. The interior walls had paintings done by Jewish artists. After the synagogue was firebombed, the Germans eventually just tore what was left out, and so there's actually nothing left. Today there is just a memorial at the site of where the synagogue was. Now, I should talk a little bit just about the day we were in Benjin. Was actually a very long day. I was there around 7:30 in the morning because I went to the municipal offices to get copies of family records out of the archives, which I will show you a little bit later. And then we started our tour, and we literally walked the entire sort of center of the city and just in the outskirts. It was a very emotional day. Um, just knowing what had happened there, knowing that that was my family's home, and it was just a very tough day. And we didn't actually we had dinner there that evening. We actually did not get back to the hotel until about 10 o'clock. So I was exhausted, but it was quite worthwhile. As I mentioned that Beijing had about 25 of these little prayer houses. They were found in apartment blocks and storefronts. They wouldn't necessarily have a rabbi, but somebody would lead the prayers. Incidentally, my maternal grandfather, my mother came from Romania, and they lived in a little shtetl, not unlike Vaslika, with about 100 Jewish families. Actually, no, 20 Jewish families, about 100 Jews. And he was actually responsible for one of these little prayer houses. And it was across the street. My mother would tell me it was across the street from their home. And they would hold services there. There was actually two in the village. There was a formal synagogue with a rabbi for those who weren't Hasidic Jews or the ultra-Orthodox Jews. They prayed at my grandfather's synagogue. This one, in particular, we had an opportunity to go into this prayer house, and as you can see, the walls have these are scenes from Jerusalem. Absolutely a stunning place. This was found in an old apartment block, and was renovated a couple of years ago and opened to the public. I had an opportunity to walk down the street where my father lived, and on the left there is it's still the same apartment building that my father, when he first got married, lived with his wife and his kids. And on the left there is a square. That's where the old Jewish market was. And I should tell you, every shtetl had three important components, which was a synagogue, a cemetery, and a market square in the center. And this was the one this is where the one in Beijing was. And this particular area was where all the butchers were. So my dad and two of my uncles all had poultry businesses. And they would have had stalls right there in that area there. And then I walked down the main street of what used to be the Jewish quarters, and the building on the left there is where my grandparents lived. To me, it probably wouldn't have looked any different back in the 30s. I walked through that entrance, that opening right next to that pink door, and there was this archway into a courtyard in the back. And I should tell you, when I went to Poland, I had there's one photo of my grandmother and some of the family members, the female family members, taken what appeared to be in 1942, based on the age of my father's two daughters. And I brought a copy of the photo along, see if somebody might be able to recognize where the photo was taken. And when I walked through here and I turned around, I immediately realized, and that's the photo right there that I'm talking about on the left, that you can see that these, uh, the building alongside here is exactly the same. I realized that the photo had been taken in this courtyard. I mean, it looks a little different. It was grass back in 42, and now it's brick. But I was in shock. I stood there speechless, and there were, and along the way there were other surprises just like this one. Um, as I mentioned, we walked through what was the ghetto. Again, it was not a walled ghetto like in other cities and towns. It was in the Kamionka region, and there's just photos of, just to give you a sense of what it was like, photos of people moving their furnishings from their apartments, because most people lived in apartments, just as what I showed you with my grandparents, my father, into these small little homes in the ghetto. In many cases, they had to, they brought furnishings with them, but there was no room in the houses. And I don't have any photos here, but I've seen photos where it's just stacked outside the houses. We stopped at this train station. The train station is quite significant because it's from these stations when they did their selections and the deportations. The people were marched to this train station. They had ramps and loaded into cattle cars and taken away to Auschwitz. And it's quite an eerie feeling knowing that your family members at one time were shoved into these cattle cars and sent to their deaths. And it's just a regular train station today. We stopped off at the Jewish orphanage in Benjin. It had actually a very good reputation. It was well financed by a number of Jewish philanthropists in the town. These two pictures are interesting. There is when we were in the Jewish history of Jewish Poles in a museum in Warsaw. I remember we stopped at I believe it was a research room or library or something like that. And Jeff Simbler, who was organizing the trip, handed me this book and said, you might find this book interesting because all the photos are taken from Beijing. And in fact, the sort of the history behind these photos was that they came from a 1943 transport from Benzin to Auschwitz. Now, I think most people know that people brought their belongings with them thinking they were going to someplace where they would need them, and they were taken away and taken to this large warehouse and sorted, and their belongings were sorted, many of them sent to Germany. Photographs were destroyed because photographs were proof that they actually were had been taken to Auschwitz. And for some reason, there were 2,400 photos from this one transport that never got destroyed. And they're still in Auschwitz today. 400 of them made their way into a book, which I actually purchased recently and sort of flipped through it. But I remember when he handed me the book, Jeff, I flipped over to the orphanage because I knew that my aunt, one of my aunts, Sarah, worked in the orphanage. She taught the kids and she worked with the kids. And I flipped it open and there were 3 photos, and this blonde woman in the center here, and she's over here, is my aunt. I'd never seen these photos before because they're in Auschwitz, and I was quite stunned. Anyways, today, the building is still there. Today, it's I understand, a children's hospital. And then finally, as I mentioned, I got copies of these. These are photographs of registration books, and they were and these things were all handwritten, as you can see, in German, because the region of Poland was annexed by Germany in October of '39, and German became the official language. And what's interesting is that I did not know the birth dates of my father's or two daughters, my half sisters. And so these things actually were quite interesting because it provided me with dates of date of births, as well as the date that my father was married. And some of the records that I had uncovered, they had conflicting dates of when my father was deported from Benjin and sent to labor camps. And these documents actually help clarify it, because he signed them at the bottom, and they're all dated. All three of them are dated December 30th, 1941, which basically told me that one set of documents, the scenario, the timeframes made sense, and the other ones were not correct. So, and if anything, it helped clarify those things. And I'm going to just stop and remind everyone, I'm coming near the end. So if people have questions, you can just put them into add them to the chat. When the formal part of the trip was over, we stayed on because we wanted to visit the Veslica, which was our ancestral home, or they called it in Yiddish, Veslitz, I believe. And it was we were staying in Krakow. It was about an hour and a half drive, and if you look at these houses here on the far right, they're probably these same homes existed, maybe 80 years ago. On the right here is sort of the main square, which would have been the market. It's sort of like a grassland area here, and there's a memorial there. But this was really a classic shtetl, where the Jews lived in the center of the village and the Poles lived outside of it. A lot of the businesses were run by Jewish people, though not exclusively. There were Poles as well. And as I mentioned earlier, my great-grandfather was complaining in a letter that in fact, it said that there were Catholic priests standing outside of Jewish businesses and telling Poles not to shop there. So there probably was friction in many probably villages just like this between Poles and Jews, although they lived together, maybe not. Things probably weren't as good as most would like them to be. And it was probably part of the motivation why my family finally left in 1930. We stopped off at the cemetery, which I was well aware no longer existed. And it was like a gated kind of little area with a hydro tower and two menorahs and a monument. This cemetery was, it's overgrown as well. I sort of climbed in there and started walking through the underbrush, and you could find, and I found and took some photographs of small little fragments of what used to be gravestones. And they're gravestones because because they were smooth and they would look carved, things carved in, and so forth. Um, and in fact, part of the cemetery, what used to be the cemetery, is now a highway that was built right over, basically probably built over graves. And probably several hundred of my ancestors were buried in this cemetery, and unfortunately, there are no gravestones left. The last day of our trip, we went to Auschwitz. A very, very difficult day, I must say. It was crowded. As I said, lots of families, lots of tourists. This is the entrance to Birkenau, not Auschwitz. To walk in there is an incredible feeling. It is so large, it's immense, and a lot of buildings still intact, towers still intact. And you can see the railroad tracks leading right up to the main entrance. In the center here is a railway spur that was built in 1944 under the direction of Adolf Eichmann, because he was in a rush to ship for over 400,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, and these tracks led right up to the where the gas chambers and crematorium were. So it was much more efficient, where people basically unloaded from the train cars and were led right into the essentially into the gas chambers. We did walk through quickly some of the blocks. This is one, excuse me, that probably housed over 1,000 people, not that large. You can see 3 levels of bunks. I'm sure you've seen in films what they look like. They were designed for 3, in some cases had 6, 7, 8 people sleeping there. And in each block, they had a two tiny little coal fireplaces, which was the only source of heat. The floor here is wood, but it was dirt at the time. That wooden floor was added for the convenience of the tourists. And this is actually in the center is one of the cattle cars that is on the site. I was actually quite surprised about the size of it. It's not that large, and they would pack 80 to 120 people into each one. And I don't even know how you could squeeze that many people in. To the right is a destroyed crematorium. They were all blown up as the Auschwitz was being evacuated in January of 1945. And to the right here is a memorial. It's where the tracks ended, and we stopped and lit candles, memorial candles, and we said a prayer for the dead. I would say it was probably for some of the family, we each read out the names of our family members that perished here. And I'd say that was probably for some of the family members, because there was no one who survived to say Kaddish, which is the prayer for the dead. It was probably the first time that anybody had ever said the prayers for them. And that's the end of my presentation. So just going to take this down and look at the chat. All right. Let's see what questions we have here. Oh, thank you. That's a message from Jeff. Somehow he enjoyed my company. That's great. Did you find that Poland has rewritten history to remove their responsibility for the Holocaust? That is, they were victims too. That's an interesting question. So they were. It's a bit of a mixed bag because there were 1 million Poles killed in concentration camps as well, and so they were in fact victims. They were not considered as they were not the Jews were at the bottom of their racial pyramid, I guess, but the Poles weren't that high up either. That's not to say that, and so it was but recent history, and I don't want to talk too much. I'm not going to get too much into it because it's a hornet's nest. But certainly, the only thing I can say is the Poles didn't build the concentration camps. Germans did. That's not to say that Poles weren't anti-Semitic, but genocide was not the idea of Poles. And in some cases, they were victims. In some cases, some people looked the other way. And in some cases, Poles did help Jews. And so it's a very much a mixed bag. But yes, the way that Germans and Poles look at the war right now and the Holocaust are probably a little different. It's very informative. Thank you. And what's this? Okay. And what else? All right. Somebody want to know how many people are on the tour? Well, people kind of floated in and out, but Jeff, about a dozen people? Is that, I think about a dozen people. I know Jeff lost about 10 people between health issues, COVID, and the war in Ukraine, which scared some people off. Though I hear it's going a little better for Ukraine these days. Okay. What's this? Someone mentioned Facebook has a group called Tracing the Tribe. I connected with members who were also access to records. Right. He's losing up because all right. And there's a guy in Montreal selling diamonds trying to catalog about 4 billion Polish Jews. Right. Yes, that's JRI Poland, which I think Jeff answered that question already. How do you retain a copy of a reparation application? Well, I had actually a copy of I guess it was a notarized document that a lawyer put together for my father. But in addition, some of that stuff or related stuff is available through the Errolson archives. There are applications that I uncovered for application for assistance, documents. There was a document in there that certified that my father was in concentration camps, which he had to use for his, and enlisted where he was. and which he was part of his application. And so that's a good place to start. I'm not sure whether or not there still exists a commission. I'm not sure whether or not they would provide documents. I didn't need to go there, but there is a body that was set up to negotiate with the Germans and allocate the funds, and it still exists. What's this? All right. Am I going the wrong way? I might be going the wrong way. I am going the wrong way. I'm answering the questions backwards. Okay. 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 Jeff has corrected me. There were 3 million Poles, 3 million Poles, not Jews, murdered by Germans. Right. Yeah. Someone asked, why I spoke about Poles and Jews. Weren't Jews Poles? Yeah, they were Poles, but that's just the terminology. Instead of saying Catholic Poles and Jewish Poles, they were just Poles and Jews. So it's just a language difference, but everyone was Polish. They were all Polish citizens. Okay. Okay, and just see if there's any more questions. I should mention while everybody's online that PBS has starting on the 18th, I believe, of September, is Ken Burns' latest documentary series, and it's on the U.S. response to the Holocaust. And if you've seen any of Ken Burns' documentary, you'll know it'll be amazing. Someone asked, do you feel differently now about being a Jew? I don't. I'm turning 69 soon. I think I think I'm set in my ways as far as being Jewish. What I would say is different is that I always considered my parents to be just parents, and sometimes very, very strange parents. They weren't like other people's parents. I see my parents now under a much different light, and I think that's the big change. I now have better understand how much they struggled through their life, and how well they did, all things considered. That they rebuilt their lives. They had new families. They saved up, retired. I wouldn't say they lived a great life, but they had a life, and that in itself is a miracle. So that's really, to me, what the big change was. And I also, recognize the trauma that they experienced, and uh, and with no support whatsoever. So to me, those things are very important. It says, I hope you will share this presentation with non-Jewish communities in Toronto so that they can learn about the Holocaust. I have been in contact with the Holocaust Education Committee in Toronto. I have offered my services to speak to groups, and particularly non-Jewish groups, about my family's experience. So there's a new museum. They're opening up a new museum in the spring of 2023, and I hope to be involved going forward. Did you meet anyone there who was alive at the time and asked questions about what they saw and knew at the time, or too difficult to do? No, I don't believe we did not meet anyone. To be honest, well, Jeff's uncle was a child survivor, and he was on the trip. And in fact, he and some of his family members were hidden for 22 months by a Polish family. And so he was he was definitely a witness to the Holocaust, but not a Pole. We did not run into anyone. You would have to have been, Jeff's uncle was just a child during the war. You have to remember the war ended 77 years ago. And so there's not that many people around anymore, though we didn't exactly look for them either. Okay, just next question. Oh, there's lots. Nazis murdered about 3 million Polish Jews, 2.5 other Polish, right? Planning any research on my mother's family? Yes, I have done research on my mother's family. Some of it is actually her family, actually a fair amount more survived. The reason that a fair amount more survived is because parts of the family, she had 3 siblings who left Europe before the war. And so there's a whole 5. Oh, okay. Well, all right. Well, I'm talking about siblings. Before the war, no, there was, hang on a second. So, but anyways, I actually, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of Romanian records. I've located a little bit, but I've discovered as well that the family migrated into Romania in late 18th century, 19th century, sorry, and from Galicia, the Ukrainian part. Unfortunately, it's in the Ukrainian part. And so accessing records might be a little bit difficult, but I'm going to try and see if I can hire people to dig up some additional stuff on my family, on my mother's family. Though, I do have a fair amount, but again, this presentation was really more based on Poland and my father's family. All right, and just trying to see what else is here. I think I got to the end. Yes, I did get to the end. And unless somebody has unless unless anybody has any additional questions, I'm going to put it to an end. I'm going to end this. I appreciate all of you sticking around through this, and um, some of you I will see soon, because some of you are local, and some of them I are far off, and I appreciate you coming to listen to me. And I will speak to you all soon. So thank you very much, and I hope I didn't bore you. Take care.